My name is Maniza Naqvi, and this is the 23rd episode of the Little Book Company podcast. Today, I'm honored to be in conversation with Muneeza Shamsie. She is a writer, critic, literary journalist, bibliographer, and editor. She is the author of a literary history, Hybrid Tapestries, The Development of Pakistani English Literature, published by Oxford University Press, and is the bibliographic representative of the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. Her memoir essays have appeared in 50 Shades of Feminism and Moving Worlds, Postcolonial South Asian Cities, and the Critical Muslim, as well as in the Journal of Postcolonial and Commonwealth Studies, Special Pakistan issue. She has edited several anthologies, the first being A Dragonfly in the Sun, an anthology of Pakistani writing in English back in 1997, Leaving Home Towards a New Millennium, a collection of English prose by Pakistani writers, and The World Changed, contemporary stories by Pakistani women. Welcome, Muneeza.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. You are such an avid and careful reader of fiction and have contributed so much to literary criticism. Really, it's a tremendous contribution, Muneeza.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
And I believe that, I don't believe, I know this, your aunt and your mother were writers as well, as are your two daughters. Can you speak to what kind of a world and environment nurtured you in this direction?
Well, actually, the literary environment didn't, in that way. I just love reading. My aunt was the novelist Atiya Hussain.
Mm-hmm.
My mother actually was very deeply steeped in Urdu literature, but she wrote her memoirs towards the end of her life, and actually had her first book published at the age of 84. That was her memoir. It was published by OUP. Mm-hmm. So that was really quite something. I grew up in an environment where everybody loved words. And my father's first language was English. He was very conscious of the way words were used. My mother was conscious. I grew up on stories. My grandmother, the maidservants, everybody was always telling me stories, and I was always reading. This is when I was a child. Then when I was 9, because I was doing badly at school, and it's a bit of a long story, I was sent away to boarding school in England. Mm-hmm. And that is really the beginning I didn't realize it then, of my interest in Pakistani English literature or South Asian English literature, because of course I loved reading, mm-hmm. but I found that my world was not represented in anything I read in England, in English. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew there was a Jungle Book, which I loved, but I mean, what did that have to do with my world? Mm-hmm. And there was passage. And so as I grew into my late teens or mid-teens, I started looking for books by different writers. And of course, I knew this body of work existed because my aunt Atiya was a well-known she had written a story collection, Phoenix Fled, and then she'd written a book called Sunlight on a Broken Column. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But unlike today, when my sister and I tried to tell our teachers that, our aunt has written a novel, they just said, "Oh, what is this novel? We've never heard of it," and they weren't interested. And so I never, in those years I was at school in England, I never really talked about this writing tradition. And then or writing by South Asians or looking for different books, although I was always reading books that were different to everybody. Mm-hmm. And then I come home to Pakistan at 19, where I was, completely at sea. Mm-hmm. And so then I start reading people like Ahmad Ali. Mm-hmm. So this is where my interest begins. And then it's not an academic story at all. It's an entirely personal story. Mm-hmm. So and then I start reading.
You read Twilight, Ahmad Ali. Mm-hmm. And, sorry, I interrupted.
Yes. No, I said it's entirely, but then I read Twilight in Delhi. Then Then I read R.K. Narayan. I started reading V.S. Naipaul. I mean, there were Indian and Pakistani writers. There wasn't that much happening in Pakistan at the time. There was more in India, but I came to know personally people like Adrian Hussain. He turned up from England, from England in the mid 1960s. That was soon after I did. He had won the Guinness Prize for Poetry, which was a tremendous achievement. And, you know, Pakistanis, when we were still banging on, there was all that other crisis of whether Pakistanis should write in English at all because of the colonial language. And if you wrote about in this language, in English, then you should do a public relations job for your country, you know. And so it was a sort of kind of, it was not really developed. Anyway, Adrian or Akbar came back, and I remember this lovely poetry reading he had in the Cafe Shazan. We sat and had chicken patties, a whole lot of us, in a long row of tables, and he stood up and he read his poetry.
Where was
so
Cafe
I came
Shazan?
Cafe Shazan, yes.
Where?
You know, in Karachi, there was a famous cafe. And
where, Muneeza?
yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I will put in these details. Where was Cafe Shazad in Karachi?
Shazan, Shezan. You know, honestly, it was somewhere in Sadr, I think, at that time.
Okay.
Later on, I think it moved to the metropole. I seem to remember it being in Sadr.
Okay.
Not 100% sure. Maybe it's a bit foggy, you know.
Not to worry. So
I seem to remember you had to go.
So there you were in Cafe, listening to this poetry.
It was a very fashionable. It was a lovely. It's in a cafe. There was Adrian. He stood up and he read his poetry. And this is, you see, this poetry was about Pakistan. It was about our lives. It wasn't. It wasn't mimicking the English. It wasn't. And it also had to do with the language in which you had been educated, and therefore which became your strongest language. That was the other debate I grew up on, by the way, was that you shouldn't write in English, you know, fiction in English. You should write non-fiction to impress the foreigner. But fiction and poetry and all that was not ours. You should write in Urdu. And the result was, I'm sure there are a lot of people who probably couldn't express themselves sufficiently well. And I mean, let's take it in a reverse situation. My mother spoke English, but supposing I'd said to my mother, write your memoirs in English, she would have had a fit, and she said, "Humse nahi ho sakta," and that would have been the end of the story.
Right.
My mother's memoirs were written in Urdu, and then they were translated. So that was her language. So, but of course, I discovered I had other women writers. I come from a family with a very strong literary tradition anyway, lots of men and all that. But among the women, there's also, in Delhi, there was Hamida Sultan Ahmed. She was also a writer. And she didn't mind that I wrote in English or what I wrote in. She was just so happy that I loved literature. She was wonderfully affectionate and supportive.
Can you speak to her writing? What was she writing?
She wrote novels. She'd done a memoir. She wrote novels. There was one novel, it was about life in Delhi. There was one novel called Rang Mahal, which she wrote. She wrote another one called Sarvatara Begum. The one I know is Rang Mahal. It was sort of kind of loosely linked on family history. It was a sort of life in a women's house, in a house, in the life of women. And the changing times. I mean, I perceive of it, and I might be wrong because, you know, to me, maybe it's the feminist answer to Twilight in Delhi. Maybe we should both study these two books, you know, accordingly. I don't know. It suddenly occurred to me because it is about life in Parda, and she was a very individualistic person, and she became a writer, you know. So she was very supportive. And then I found, all my relatives, they randomly, you know, there was another, my mother's first cousin, Hamida Sayyid Zafar Khan. She was the first woman ophthalmologist in undivided India. Her brother was the famous communist Mahmoud Zafar. And she wrote her memoirs after they were published after she died. So we had this kind of tradition of people writing away, often with a view. Actually, that was also part of a very strong subcontinental tradition, which has been forgotten, is that people wrote memoirs and books, not to be published, but just to be passed on to the younger generation, you know, for their families. And I'm sure there is a huge collection of family memoirs somewhere that we need to dig out.
I think you are onto something, and I have a hunch that the same hunch that there are many memoirs sitting tucked away in wardrobes and closets
Yes.
and drawers, and no one is going to find them, or they'll get eaten up by insects before we can get to them, or by mildew. And but people. The grandchildren of the people who've written these should preserve these and have them published, even self-published if they have to, because this is the history we all share.
Well, yes, I mean, my mother, my mother wrote her just to be passed on to the family. And she actually she gave a copy. It was in Urdu. She gave a copy to Amina Sayyed and said, "Beta, tum bhi pad lo." And Amina had it read, and she said, "Oh." And at that time, OUP didn't have a Urdu program, so she had it translated by Tahra Naqvi. And then the second, then the Urdu program began, and then they had it published in Urdu. But this is an important thing in the point of what language you need or can express yourself. I think that's terribly important to understand that and respect that when we talk about whatever language and why they've written in this language or that language. I mean, some bilingual writers, I mean, people like Haris Khalik, who writes, he writes in Punjabi, Urdu, and English. He will tell you something like, although I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, that, different languages offer you different dimensions that you can reach out to. And I find that very interesting.
Yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And your one's ability to emote changes perhaps with language, and perception also. You have access to so much more vocabulary, perhaps, when you are able to express yourself in different languages. Muneeza, I want to take you back a little bit, back to the boarding school years, and can you speak to that? That here you were in England in boarding school.
Yes.
Shortly, well, not shortly, but a little while after the Raj was over.
Yes.
And yet people, the kids in school with you, the girls in boarding school with you, and the teachers were not aware of the literature out of South Asia.
Well, never mind the literature. We were post-war England. And I had relatives who had all fought in World War II. And in all the films and all the books I saw, there was never a single mention of a single Indian soldier. So that is one obvious thing. No, they were colonial. I mean, a lot of the girls, their parents were, someone's parents was in Singapore, someone was in Singapore, Ceylon as it was then. A lot of them came from these colonial countries, and they were not interested in this literature of an alternative literature. And even frankly, it was a bit out of date. But even the maps in geography were colored pink, so my poor little country didn't exist in these maps.
Yeah, and so India,
that was another trauma. So all these things one had to negotiate, somehow.
Yeah, and the size also of the map, the countries such as large as the subcontinent India was so, in comparison to Britain, was shown to be quite small, and the entire continent of Africa seemed to be tinier than Europe.
Well, I don't remember that. I just remember they were all pink. This really pink for British Empire, which really depressed me, And we learned to negotiate all this, and the way history was taught. Mind you, there's some of the staff, one or two of the staff were quite sort of. I mean, sometimes I would grumble, for example, when they taught history. History was taught all wrong. It was all the black hole of Calcutta and all this nonsense. And I would sit there and grumble, and the teacher, that particular teacher, would just nod politely and smile. So she gave me that acknowledgement, but she had a curriculum to cover, So there we are,
And so now you come back at age 19.
Yeah.
Pakistan.
Yes.
Now you're facing another problem. Again.
Terrible problem. Yes.
So I'm sorry I had interrupted you earlier. Please speak more to that.
No, you hadn't interrupted me. I was completely at sea. I was in this. Of course, it was wonderful to be home. That I've always loved this thing about Karachi. I love the sunlight, by the way.
Yes.
I used to just stand out the window and look at the sun. I don't like the cold. I love the sunlight. I love the sense of being home, and especially when you grow up and you live with guardians and so on, you really appreciate at home. You can do all sorts of nakhras. You can make a fuss. You can be bloody minded. Parents love you. You have to behave yourself when you go and live with other people. So there was this wonderful sense of, it's a different sense of freedom, other than the bond and the affection. And of course, the other thing I loved about being home, about being Pakistan, was the intergenerational links. You didn't have to explain anything about anybody, my English life is slightly sort of remote and they didn't understand what it was all about. But I loved the fact that people, one of my, people took me out, people so nice. A friend took me under her wings. She and her husband would pick me up for parties, drop me home, this kind of thing, and then my father took me on a grand trip. Well, he was a company executive, and they had, he did a tour of, he went up north. He took my mother because it was part of their sort of thing that there were family interactions and whatnot. And so I was taken I went to Lahore, Mardan, Swat, Korakata, Chittagong, Dhaka. I did this grand tour of the country. And then, of course, I come back to Karachi, and then I realized how vibrant Karachi is, how different it is, and how much more freedom I had, actually, than most girls of my generation. And I mean, I was allowed to work and things like that kind of thing,
Where did you work?
Well, my training, I actually did a secretarial training, which I now realize was most unusual also. After I left school, I lived in London all by myself, in a hostel, mind you, in a sort of secretarial college. So I did a secretarial training here. And here being, because I'm in London at the moment. And then I went back, and first of all, I worked for Population Advisor, the Development Economics, which was interesting, because then I discovered all sorts of, I used to read the papers I used to write, and then I began to discover about Pakistan and population issues and all these kind of things, Then my next job was with the Belgian embassy. I held that for 2-3 years. And then I worked for that was quite brief because I got engaged at that point. And then I worked for my friend's father. And then I got engaged and I got married. And I stopped work, and my husband said, "Do what you like. You want to go to coffee parties, play bridge. One of my friends said, "Look, you've always muttered about writing. Why don't you write?" So I started writing. And when my husband found I was serious, he brought me a computer. So I went on typing. That was my typing. Actually, that whole secretarial experience turned out to be absolutely invaluable in my journalistic career. The typing, the presentation of papers, being able to pick up a telephone and say, I want this kind of information, you know, you knew how to ring up. It was the most invaluable experience.
Yes.
I had not expected it to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be a scientist, by the way. That was my real ambition. Yes. And I was told there were no jobs. Well, there were no jobs for women scientists in Pakistan. End of story.
But did you have grades for going into the sciences?
Did I have
the grades? Would you have been able to enroll into the science side of a college had you?
Well, I did. No, I did. I did A-level chemistry and biology.
Were you good at it?
Well, I suppose I was. But I mean, the point is that there was no future, so I didn't really, it was just, it all just sort of collapsed. That's why I went through quite a difficult time because of all this, not knowing what I wanted to do and all that.
Because
so yeah,
a lot of
the school was very encouraging and was wanting me to do it, but they didn't know the realities of the world that I was inhabiting.
And so now you're in Karachi, and tell me a little bit, but the social life must have been brilliant at that time.
Yeah, I had a great social life, and I made good friends, and both of them were actually artists, so I came to know the art community, and we were very sort of we were sort of armchair rebels, grumbling about you can't do this and you can't do that. We didn't actually do anything very radical, but we grumbled.
Well,
but I made good friends and I had a good social, and I was typing away, but it took me years because I realized there was such a gap between the time I had left school and when I started typing, and I used to look at which I don't have anymore, my old essays and think, gosh, I used to write like that. And then I would read, I don't know, I'm entirely self-taught, And then again, the same friend to me said, this is nonsense, you've got to start feeling a writer. This was years past, and my children got born and all this. And then I started contributing articles, and one day Dawn rang me up and asked me to write for them. And I nearly fell off my bed. And I never really looked back.
But you see, now if I look at the hybrid tapestries, the development of Pakistani English literature, that could have been your PhD.
Well, I suppose it could have.
Muneeza Shamsie, I now confer a doctorate on you from the Little Book Company. Because
thank you.
Indeed, for all
entirely self-taught.
Yes, and that's remarkable and commendable. And to speak to me a little bit about your first anthology, the Dragonfly in the Sun.
Well, actually, you see, we have to go back slightly again because of my work. Started working in Dawn. I had my editor at that time. They had the new magazine at the time, Mr. Muhammad Ali Siddiqui. He discovered I was interested in literature. I was reading all this while, mind you, and I used to go to all those mixed voices gatherings and all that people like Adrian Hussein and all used to have, and So I was very much in the literature aspect. And he discovered I was interested in literature. So he started sending me off to do literary interviews and reviews. One of my earliest interviews was Hanif Qureshi, who turned up in Pakistan, I think about 1983. Then, people like Roxana Ahmed came and Amir Hussain came. So I was writing about all these people. And in the meantime, South Asian English literature had really taken off. And when I was asked by OUP to do this anthology because Pakistani, because that was the 50th anniversary of Pakistan. And I'm not sure that I've not written this in my introduction. I know I've said it often, people kept saying to me, but there's so many Indian writers, why haven't we got any in Pakistan? But the fact was, I was writing about Pakistani authors all the time. So I had this material, and then I was very lucky because Professor Muhammad Umar Mehman said to me, there are these writers in America, and I didn't know about them. So that's how I contacted Tahra Naqvi and Muazzam Sheikh, and I came to know all these writers. And that's how, when I put together my anthology, which was a retrospective, of course, it begins with Shahid Surawardi, who very few people had remembered at that time, but he was a wonderful writer. And most people were astonished that I had a collection of 44 writers writing in English of Pakistani origin.
Speak to us
So
about
that's how that
tell us about his writing.
About who's writing?
Shahid Surawardi's writing.
Shahid Surawardi. Oh, well, he's actually very fascinating. He of course was the brother. His brother was Shahid Surawardi, who became prime minister. He was from that. He's actually and the first cousin is Begum Ikramullah, Begum Shasta Ikramullah, who I must say I should have told you that she also took me under her wing, and she introduced me to a lot of Urdu literature, which I read in translations later, because I'm afraid I was a bit, because I wanted to read the stories. I'm not all that sort of, I didn't want to do the Muzakkar Muannas. I wanted to get on with the stories. So, which is really very rotten when it comes to languages. But Shahid Surawardi, he started writing. I mean, his family was they wrote in English from an early age. I think one of his aunts or his sisters, she used to be an instructor at Calcutta University or something. So they were very intellectual. And he wrote his first book called Faded Leaves, I think early 20th century, where he tried to introduce the Oriental experience. He tried to imitate aspects of Ghazal. Anyway, then he goes to Oxford. And what is so fascinating about him, I mean, he's had a fascinating life. And he then goes to Oxford. And from Oxford, he was multilingual, so he learned umpteen languages. He then went to Moscow, where I think he went to the university at Moscow. There he put on Tagore plays by Stanislavski. He wrote a wonderful essay, Tagore at Oxford, because when Tagore won the Nobel Prize, Shahid Surawardi was at Oxford, and he came, and so he wrote an essay. And then he comes back to India finally after many, many years. It's a very long story. He had to flee from the Bolshevik revolution, and then he comes to Paris, and he lives in Paris for many years. He knew all sorts of writers. Robert Bridges considered him on some book he was doing on writing, on Orientalist writing. And then he comes back, and his books actually, he wrote books on art, prefaces, where he writes about developments in art. He was the first modern art critic, and he wrote this wonderful poetry collection, which is called Essays in Verse. He was the first to give Indian English poetry a modern voice. He looked to people like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, whereas at that time, all the other poets were doing that Orientalist kind of writing, and putting that giving it a sort of Indian or Oriental kind of look. And he moved away from that. And then he also co-translated Chinese poetry. I mean, he was just amazing. So sadly, I never got to meet him.
So he does sound remarkable.
No, that's him. That's Shahid Surawardi.
Yes, it sounds.
That's Shahid Surawardi's brother. Yes.
And
he was very remarkable.
Yes, and I think that just this whole ability, this life event of going, having to go across so many different cultures and be not only functional in so many different cultures, but to thrive in them is makes for this sort of a person, you know.
Well, the Bangladeshi poet Kaisar Haq has done a wonderful book on him called The Collected Poems of Shahid Surawardi, which came out, I think, about 10 years ago. So it's a very good collection. He knows, he's a real expert on him. And he also translated a Russian book by the Musulmans, something of the Musulmans. And then when he was ambassador, then he was Pakistan's ambassador to Spain. There he decided to do some more research on an article he'd written. And that was his posthumously published book on the Muslim culture in Spain. The title eludes me right now, but
that's all right.
Oh dear. Well, sorry.
We'll look at.
But it was about the. Yes, yes. Please do. Shahid Surawardi's. It came out quite, and again, it was an OUP publication.
So this was about the time it was on Andalus and Andalusia's history.
It was a. I think there's something the Musulmans of Spain.
Okay.
It's something the Musulmans of Spain, and he looks into the whole art and culture and everything. And he was also from that early time, he was also very, very interested in cross-cultural links, in cultural commingling across continents, as opposed to the whole nonsensical East-West divide that has been sort of promoted by the colonials or pre-colonials, whatever you like.
Yes.
But he saw links between different cultures all over the world,
And to be able,
it was amazing.
And to be able to see that, well, yes, colonialism and empire, but that has created a new kind of a person who has the ability to be everything all at once.
Yes, he was amazing. Absolutely amazing.
So here, Muneeza, we'll take a small pause and we'll come right back in. All right?
Okay, all right.
So, Muneeza, am I right that A Dragonfly in the Sun was your first book?
Yes.
So how did it feel for you to hold your first book in your hands?
Oh, tremendous. I was so excited about it, and I was just blown away that it got such a great response. And my friend Nahid Jafri Asfar did the cover for it, which I loved. I have to, she was responsible for the cover. It was just wonderful. I mean, I just what can I say? I was just blown away. Actually, I was so thrilled.
And for the long time, it was the source material, the resource that one had to read, because there was no other compendium of Pakistani literature in English.
Well, it was really nice. I mean, it opened out other opportunities for me also, and I started being invited to talk about it, and then I was I had actually left a copy in the flat of my aunt Atiya, and again back in London, and the academic Ranjana Ash came by and saw it and said, "I didn't know so many Pakistanis wrote in English," and she was very excited, and she then put me in touch with someone in SOAS, and I went and gave a small little talk in SOAS, and then later on, because of this work, I was asked to give talks here and there, and then I was sent to the Cambridge seminar. I was sent by the British Council to the Cambridge seminar on British writing, which was a 10-day sojourn at Downing College, and they had writers from they had about 50 of us writers and academics from the world over, and academics, well-known British academics who would come and talk to us. It was just amazing, and then we would interact with them. It was, and it just opened out more and more opportunities. But it also raised issues because, for example, a lot of people grumbled and they said, "Oh, why have you got Hanif Qureshi? And what are these random writers we leave it?" That was the other crisis we had. We thought that in order to qualify as a Pakistani writer, you had to be living in Pakistan. And they didn't, they would exclude. I mean, Zulfikar Ghaus, who was such a wonderful writer. For years, nobody knew. They only know the murder of Aziz Khan for years because he wrote about Brazil. They said, "Oh, well, he's not Pakistani and he writes about England." They would, and as academics have written that actually his Brazilian trilogy is the murder of Aziz Khan written on a larger scale. Now, these kind of links were not being made.
Yes.
And so, anyway, the point was there was all this sort of quibbling about why had I got these random non-Pakistanis, so to speak, or people who weren't living there. And as you know, that, especially when you travel there, people have more than one identity. You could belong to a country, but you have other dimensions to you.
Yes.
And so that led me to suggest my second anthology, Leaving Home. What does migration mean? What when you leave and when you come back, and as you know, that includes migration at partition. It includes migration from the West and vice versa, and also the experience of coming back after many years. And I was, and I also wanted to not restrict. I mean, we have writers who write in Urdu, who write very good English, and among them was Fehmida Riaz and Intizar Hussain, and they also contributed, and I was very pleased. So that's how the Dragonfly led to the other one.
What you're saying about Zulfikar Ghaus's writing about Brazil. I mean, I feel like when we travel or when we immigrate or migrate, we still ourselves, and we are transformed by the experience, but we bring a prism through which we are viewing the world we've entered into, and we see the similarities. Something in everywhere we go, there we are, right? And we see prism. So he still shares so many commonalities with South Asia and the social and political experience and emotional experience that we as individuals have, both in the personal and the political. To speak more to Zulfikar Ghaus's writing, if you can, Muneeza.
What can I say? I mean, I'm such a great admirer of his. He has. I mean, his body of work is enormous. He's done about 11 works of fiction, about 5 works of criticism, about 7 or 8 poetry volumes, and most of this was being kind of not now. Now it's been acknowledged, and he was actually given the UBL Lifetime Achievement Award. It was posthumously, sadly, but it was still given. Otherwise, we just excluded him. He wrote. What can I say? His Murder of Aziz Khan was his second book, and he came from the outside. That was it. Also gave him a freedom, by the way, because he came for a cricket match. He loved cricket, and he came for a cricket match, and then he toured, and he remembered, because of course he had been. I mean, we need to go back into his story. His story that he belonged to a family from Sialkot, and then when he was about 5 or 6, very young, this family moved to Bombay. and he lived in Bombay actually through the partition riots. And at the partition, the whole experience of partition, which he writes about in his later in his book Triple Mirror of the Self. And then he moves to England, and then he marries a Brazilian, and he moves to America. So he has an enormous sort of span, and he transmutes these experiences into his fiction in wonderful ways. And his I think it's his 9th or 10th novel, called The Triple Mirror of the Self, is actually works backwards from South America, England, India, and to Pakistan. And it's a beautiful book because it ends with the mirror images of the Andes and the Hindu Kush. And he wrote books about England also. His one of his books I found very interesting, called Crump's Terms. It's about a woman of German origin, I think. And that was really very rare in post-war England. Well, and his whole description of, again, moving across worlds from South Africa, Germany, England, people didn't really write like that. He was very keen. He was very anti, or not very anti. He was wanting very much to look at new dimensions. He was not interested. He actually used to dismiss unfairly The Murder of Aziz Khan because it was a realist novel. He didn't think you should write it. He wrote metafiction. He wrote different forms of writing. He explored. He explored many things, and he also realized that when he was living in England, that the short story at that time was very vibrant in America, but it was not in England. And there were a lot of things happening in America that were not happening in England, where the British literature was still in a sort of kind of early stage of transition, perhaps you could say, from into the modern world. And he was very much a part of new literary movements. I mean, he's an amazing writer.
As you're talking, Muneeza, I realize how ignorant I am. I'm going to be right after running to get all the books by Zulfikar Ghose. Really, I'm so ignorant. And again, just listening to you, I it's such a pleasure.
He's done one South American, one of his South American novels is a sort of reconstruction of Twelfth Night, if you can imagine such a thing. He was just amazing.
I've only met him maybe twice, but I couldn't really get him into a conversation. He seemed to be a very quiet person who sort of didn't enjoy idle chatting.
Probably not. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I interviewed him a couple of times, and I sort of met him. I suppose he wasn't chatty, but he was just very interesting, and he was very. One of the things I remembered was when people asking, why are you writing in English? Pakistani, why are you writing in English? So he said that, well, he said, why don't you ask Nabokov why he's writing in English? Why don't you ask Conrad why he's writing in English? Yes. And I thought, well, this is brilliant,
Yes,
and he's quite right, of course.
Yes, and I think this has been a frustration for most of the English writers of Pakistani origin, where instead of reading what they're writing, you're criticizing their expression, the language in which they're expressing themselves. It's without...
Yes, and often... Yes, and no, the other thing that this brings me to the other point is the other thing where you are also not getting the complications of trying to convey the Pakistani experience into English without belaboring the point.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, an example like Daniel writes about village life and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel Muinuddin. And
Mm-hmm.
he does it in this sort of tremendously smooth prose, but it's actually quite a challenging thing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And people don't look at it from that point of view, you know.
Yes, with very sort of
And
spare language and precise, and as you're saying, not
yeah,
belaboring the point. Uh-huh.
yes,
Uh-huh.
you
I
know, because what you can say in one language is part of your culture is not evident in the other language,
mm-hmm.
you know, and how do you convey it,
Mm-hmm. That's true.
you know.
And perhaps even and for those who speak, let's say, Urdu and Punjabi only, they may not see what Danielle is able to see
Yes,
simply because they're,
that is, yeah,
yeah, they're blind.
that is,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And from and we've spoken about Zulfikar Ghosh. Who else do you admire deeply in the Pakistani uh, canon, if you want to call it?
Oh, who do I admire? I admire everybody. I admire a lot of the younger writers. I mean, we've talked about the senior writers. I don't like to sort of pick one out and all the others. Actually, I mean, you know, there are a lot of them that I really admire, and
Well,
I wouldn't like to, you
no,
know,
let
sort
me
of pick one.
make it easier for you. Let's not talk about the younger writers, or but you know, in that same period as Zulfikar Ghosh, and when he, who else is there that you would say, you know, we should all be reading?
Zulfikar Ghosh was actually, there wasn't anybody else at that time when he started off in the 67.
Mm-hmm.
There was not very much. Well, then of course the main breakthrough is Babsy.
Yes.
You know, she was the first one to make that breakthrough of getting published here, or she was living in Pakistan. I mean, otherwise it was very difficult for a writer living in Pakistan to get published abroad. You didn't have the kind of communication like you do now. There was no internet or anything, and
And
it was really very hard.
yes, and she
Yes,
self-published to
but
begin.
she's self-published.
Mhm.
But she told me told me, I mean, how difficult it was to get published, because at that point, because we hadn't also hit the headlines, although not so disastrously, but people said to us, too remote a country. Who's heard of it? You know.
Yeah,
Hello.
it's an odd thing to say. Remote
Yes.
country, we're in the bank center of everything and have been for so long.
I know. No, they felt, you know, where is it? I mean, I remember going to America about 1917, people asking me where I was from, and I hadn't a clue where it was. I was most depressed.
Oh,
Um,
I take my words back because I remember getting so frustrated by saying, you know where China is? And yes, well, actually, you don't know where China is, but go ahead, take a shovel, dig to China, then walk across, and you get to Pakistan. All right?
yeah, it was, you know, and but of course now everyone knows where it is also. You know, now it's a sort of for whatever. Anyway, but yes, Babsy did tremendous work, and I mean, her wit and her humor, and I mean, you know, the creators are just so hilarious, and the irreverence, and you know, just wonderful. And Ice Candy Man is also such a powerful work.
Yeah.
You know, what can one say? And I
And,
think the bride.
mm-hmm.
I think the bride also coincided with the feminist movement. That was another thing that happened that I've written somewhere. That actually, when the feminist movement, you know, the 1980s feminist movement begins, and women start writing, and whether they're writing in Urdu or they're writing in English, but they're expressing the experience of women. And suddenly, to some extent, that kind of division or this otherness kind of starts to fade, you know. I remember this quite clearly. and her book was, she was, of course, very much a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had Roxana coming in, her work, you know. So that.
And
There's
sorry?
yes, I think there's lots of new talent also coming up, you know.
Mm-hmm. And speak to me a little bit about your daughter Saman Shamsi's books, children's books.
Ah, someone's. Well, someone actually started writing just by chance. One of her friends was expecting a baby and said, "Oh, why don't you write a story for my child? You use words so well." So she wrote her first book, The Adventures of Slothful Slough-Off, which is full of puns. And you know, play on words. They loved the play on word. So someone actually just became a writer, sort of en passant, you know. And then she wrote another one, the Magical Woods, and then now she's done The Rivers Meet, and she's got another one coming out shortly. So she's, and of course she teaches, so she's very much a part of. She teaches 11-year-olds. I mean, she didn't in the early days. She used to teach older children, so she's and very aware of children and their reading and that kind of thing. So someone's books have been really rather wonderful. I mean, I enjoy them, but you know, I don't like to comment on my children's or my daughter's work because I'm a prejudiced mother, frankly.
Well, you're
You know, beginning end of story.
allowed to be because their mother, and you might have noticed I've skirted around of you speaking to Kamila's work. I mean, you must be very proud of Saman's books, and as you are proud, I'm sure, of Kamila's work. After all, you know, these are your children, and you must have had an enormous
Yes, indeed. Yes, I must have had
an enormous influence in you know, in nurturing them in this direction, in their writing, in their reading, in their love for literature.
Well, actually, everybody says this. I always felt I did nothing, you know. Um, I actually just let them be. I didn't tell them to write stories. Kamla wanted to write when she was very young, when she was about 11. So I just told her to write. I just let her be. I didn't say you've got to be a writer, or you've got to do this, so you've got to do that. I just let them potter around. But what I do know is that when, again, because I loved stories myself, from a very young age, I used to read to them. And they, to the extent that there were books that they didn't, they couldn't read, but they knew there was time to turn the page, and they would say, "Other page," turn the page, and so I used to read to them, and then they started reading, and I don't know, and they just enjoyed reading. Kamla became very conscious of wanting to be a writer at a very young age. Someone actually, her first degree was in ceramics. Yeah.
That's
And then, yeah. So she does have a very creative instincts. And then she went into teaching. And then that's a full-time job now, which she seems to love.
Did you ever
did I ever
teach?
Well, I did in a sort of I did volunteer work. I taught music and mime at a school for special education for about 7 or 8 years.
Music?
My friend, music and mime.
But do you play an instrument?
Well, yes, this is, yes, I play piano. I mean, I don't now, but I wasn't a brilliant pianist. But my friend Meher Hassan, who now, the organization I worked for is ACELP, the Association of Children with Education and Learning Problems, and it's really going strong. It's just opposite the Jinnah Hospital. It's a wonderful organization. But in those days, it was very new. This was in the 1970s. And they were in a rent. They had started the school in a rented space, and Meher came up to me and she said, "Do you play the piano?" And I said, "Yes." So she said, "Well, we've got a piano in this place we've hired. Why, that's been lent to us. Why don't you come and play the piano for our children?" So I said, "Okay." So I, happily turned up there, and I used to 2 or 3 times a week. And we would go and we would sing songs, and it sort of brings music, brings children out. I mean, the greatest moment was when a child who didn't sing, who had a big problem, suddenly starts singing. It was such a joy. So I did that for about 7 or 8 years.
Wow, that's so
But
beautiful.
then,
A place opposite Jinnah?
well, now it's opposite Jinnah. Yes, it's right next door to the kidney center, and opposite Jinnah. And it's ACELP, and now I mean, they've really taken off. I mean, in those days it was very new, and I just went in as a volunteer, and basically by that time the issue was whether I would have had to go on and have proper professional training, and by then, of course, my writing career also. So I went into writing because that was my great sort of passion, I suppose.
Well,
Do
you
but
still...
I've always been interested in special education as a result.
Do you still play the piano?
No, I don't. I was always too self-conscious. I mean, I did play it. I learned to play it. I had both my daughters learn to play the piano, so I felt it was very good for them. But none of us play anymore. But I love music. I love going to concerts and things. Yes.
Oh, that's
when I
always...
yes, when I lived in London, I would just walk away from the Albert Hall, and when I felt gloomy and depressed, I used to go and I used to sit up on the gods and listen to some fabulous concert, and that would cheer me up. So that's my engagement with music. I love music.
I think I do too, but I can't play an instrument, and I really admire it so much. Admire anyone who can play the piano, and it doesn't matter. And not everybody is of concert standard, and that's quite all right.
Yeah,
able to play an instrument, that's so lovely. Did you learn that at boarding school?
I learned it at boarding school, and yes, that was one of the extras I took. So I learned to play the piano. I did certain things. I mean, I am actually very self-conscious when I have to do things. That's why also writing suits me, because I can sit in my own space. Someone and Kamla both learned the piano. Someone was actually, they had a very good choir in Karachi. Someone was also part of a choir in Karachi for many years. And they did wonderful performances. But then it got dispersed. I think the person who organized it migrated and so on. But she does. I mean, well, but she is. I mean, she's quite involved in the creative side of her school and all that. So she does quite a lot of that.
And you are no longer involved with the special education voluntary work.
No, not at all. I mean, not at all. I've sort of moved away, but it is a subject that I'm interested in, and I'm, very proud that ASELP has done so well. It's a very good organization. I think I'm not sure. I might be wrong, but I think they were the first to offer education to in this field. Schooling. That I don't think there was such a project before that. I might be wrong, but I seem to have this impression of schooling and education, training, and
in a formal way. Yes. Yeah. And is there
in a formal way?
Are you working on something new at the moment?
No, I've got a new anthology, which is my fourth anthology, a follow-up of Dragonfly and the Sun. So it's from 1998 from now.
Mhm.
Now, so that is in the offing. I hope it'll come out. OUP has it, so I hope that'll come out soon.
Also, you.
And
Mhm.
we're bringing out a new edition of my mother's memoirs. But otherwise, at the moment, I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, let's see what I do next.
Mhm. I'm sure
I'm thinking.
you're thinking. You're thinking, and
Well, no, I'm quite busy. I'm quite busy with quite a lot of things. The Journal of Commonwealth Literature, and then there's a literary encyclopedia where I edit the Pakistan section and all this sort of thing. So I'm actually quite busy, but there's nothing new as such at the moment.
I think, Maniza, you need to submit this to some university and say, "Give me a PhD doctorate for this."
Oh, too late now.
No, as you've proven,
Oh.
it is not ever late, and you do such wonderful work, and it's always such a pleasure to listen to you and to hear your views on literature, and you know so much, and you have such a depth.
No, wonderful talking to you, and you've done such amazing work.
Well, thank you, Maniza. I don't think it compares really, and
Well, yes.
I want to ask you, well, were you saying that you told us all the different things that you're involved with right now. Are you also involved in any way in shaping the way the literature festivals happen in Pakistan?
Well, I don't know whether I'm responsible in the way that they happen. They ask me for advice and I give it.
Mhm.
It's sort of, it's a bit that. So I do put in my two bits here and there, but I don't. The organization and shaping is done by the people concerned. That's their department. I just give bits of advice here and there if they ask for me.
But I
So
think
I'm involved in.
valuable advice. What are you reading? Before we close out, what are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? Actually, I am on holiday, so I'm not reading anything. I'm the jet lag.
Because
So I'm just
reading is
vegetating.
the work. So you're taking a holiday from.
I'm vegetating. So I'm vegetating. If you can imagine such a thing.
Most
Yes.
people tend to take along a book on their holiday. So, and you're like, I'll keep away from that for a while. Thank you. You go for walks.
Well, yeah, well that's sort of well, I go for walks. I'm supposed to go for walks in Karachi also.
Mhm.
Yeah, one goes for walk. No, I've got books in Kamla's bookshelves that I've been eyeing, but haven't kind of started off on anything yet.
Anything jump out
Quite
at
honestly. No, I don't think I don't. I think there are all sorts of random things, and that's nothing that's I haven't thought this one through yet, so I'm not going to go into it. Yeah,
well,
but there are lots of books.
a lot of what we've talked about today, particularly going from, transmuting different experiences in different countries. I love the way you put that. I've just finished reading Damon Galguit's In a Strange Room, which was also nominated for the Booker back in,
Ah,
uh, when was it? It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, I think in 2010. I'm not
okay. What is that about? Jog
It
my memory.
it is about traveling. It's it is fiction, but it's
Ah,
of a
he's
travel.
very
Mhm.
ah,
And
he's very good.
yes.
I
So I would highly recommend you try this one, In a Strange Room.
okay. I read The Promise,
Yes.
and I read yes, and I read it. I will check this one out. Yeah.
So what did you, can you speak to the promise a little?
Can I speak about it?
Yes, because I don't want to let you go.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see. Well, actually, I did interview him, for the Lahore and for one of the literature festivals, Karachi maybe.
Mhm.
Well, the promise, it's about South Africa,
Mhm.
and I mean, I just thought it was so fascinating the way he dealt with the issues of race and the house promised to the maid and which is not given, and how the whole environment changes and how the government changes and how they again the dream of freedom and how it all turns into corruption and disorder. And I again, they were it was fascinating how there were links and not links,
Mhm.
about the governments and shifty people in government, and which we all know about. But it was there in South Africa, and then this racist thing about the maidservant and not who had looked after the lady, and not that was the promise that she'd been promised this house, and then none of the family want to give it, and all their different sort of family tensions. It's a beautiful book. I mean, he's a terrific writer.
Yes,
I really admire him. Good,
I do too. And just
you know.
the daughter who says, "Well, no, this is a promise, and it has to be kept."
Yes, yes, there is that also. That there is. I mean, yes, there because she's the unconventional one, isn't she?
Mhm. Yes.
She's the one, isn't she? And she pushes for it. It is very nice. I really liked it.
Mhm.
And the way he, of course, shows that through her, of course, he shows changing times also, or changing attitudes, doesn't he?
Yes.
From the earlier generation.
Yes.
It's a great book.
And
I really admire him.
yeah, and he has such a quiet way of expressing. Somehow it
Yes.
comes through in that very gentle manner that he has to say very powerful things, rageful things.
Yes. Yes. He's very also, he's very sort of understated and quiet, as you say. And his writing is beautiful. It's so vivid, the way he brings South Africa and the changing times and everything to life. It is very nice.
So, Muneeza, we're running out of time, and I just want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Maniza. I think I've rambled on an awful lot, actually, but and thank you for the little book company.
Well, thank
by
you.
the way.
And I don't think you've rambled at all, and I would have extracted another half hour out of you, but I think I've tired you out. It's been more than an hour that we've spoken. Thank you so very much. Enjoy your holiday.
Thank you. And we shall meet again soon, I hope.
Very soon. All right. Bye for now.
Okay. Bye-bye.